not going to answer another question. You just says, I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
Mr. Colombo, are you a boss of the Mafia?
No, I am not.
Is there a Mafia?
No, there is not.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as American citizens. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
Are you going to have anything to say, Mr. Genevieve?
Are you going to cooperate with the commission?
I used to watch my father go to work with a lunch pail and a toolbox, and I used to see the guys across the street walking around with $500 suits and $5,000 pinky rings and brand new Cadillacs. I wanted a car like that. I wanted a pinky ring. I wanted to roll $100 bills. And I wound up succeeding, unfortunately.
Let's be frank about it. Organized crime is us. It's not them. We're the ones that buy the dope. We're the ones that buy the stolen property. We're the ones who buy the labor piece. We're the ones who buy the sweetheart contracts. We're the ones who don't want competition in the construction industry, who don't want competition in the garment districts. How deeply entrenched is organized crime in this country? Very deep, because it's us. It's our corrupt nature.
The Mafia, organized crime, gangsters. They've fascinated the American public for over a century. The public has always seen gangsters as charming rogues, men who live and die by their own rules, modern-day Robin Hoods. But what is the true story of these men and the multi-billion-dollar empire of crime they controlled, not only in New York, but across the nation for most of the 20th century? We've seen gangsters portrayed in blockbuster films such as The Godfather and Goodfellas, and we see them on television in hit shows like The Sopranos. But where is the line between the romanticized version of the Mafia we see in the movies and on TV and the true story of La Cosa Nostra? This story begins in southern Italy many centuries ago.
You know, if you realize that as an Italian, the peninsula of Italy, particularly the southern part, by which I mean from Naples all the way down through Sicily, it was a land from the time of the fall of Rome that was conquered by outsiders, one after the other, one after the other. Historically, the Mafia comes out of Sicily and southern Italy, Calabria, my area, comes out of a tradition in which they were trying to counteract the corruption that was entrenched in the power that was centered in Naples or centered in Palermo and Sicily.
From the fall of the Roman Empire through to the early 1860s, when Giuseppe Garibaldi united Italy as one nation, the Italian peninsula was controlled by the Vatican and the King of Italy in the north, and by foreign powers in the south. For many centuries, the Arabs, Spanish, English, Greeks, Austrians, French, and Germans, among others, controlled the various regions in the south. These foreign powers ruled with an iron fist and made every effort to keep the population of southern Italy poor, ignorant, and completely submissive. As such, if a poor Italian peasant in a small village had a grievance or had suffered at the hands of the occupying forces, he had nowhere to turn. Because this situation existed in virtually every small village throughout southern Italy, dating back to the Arab occupation of Sicily in the 9th century, an underground organization was formed that became known to local populations as the Mafia. The word Mafia is a bastardization of an Arabic word meaning refuge. In the many centuries of foreign occupation throughout southern Italy, there were numerous instances where the young daughter or wife of a poor villager was raped or abused by one of the occupying troops. The father or husband of that young girl couldn't go to the governing officials, who do nothing to discipline their own troops. Instead, he went to the Don of the village, the Padrone of the local Mafia, Within a short time, the guilty soldier was found beaten up or dead somewhere in the village. Or perhaps that soldier just disappeared. Of course, this underground government lined its own pockets for the services it provided the villagers. But in return, they protected and sought justice for the downtrodden people of the South who couldn't defend themselves. This scenario and others like it played itself out thousands of times in villages and small towns throughout southern Italy for many hundreds of years. Even after Garibaldi united the nation, the poor people of the South were still taken advantage of by the government in Rome, and the Mafia flourished and grew more powerful, expanding into other criminal activities and in some cases holding elected offices within the regional governments throughout southern Italy. Between 1890 and 1920, over 2 million Italians immigrated to America. Most came from the poor villages of southern Italy. With them, they brought all the great traditions of a centuries-old culture. They also brought with them the tradition of an underground government. This gave rise to the forerunner of the Mafia in New York and America, the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a loosely knit group of criminals who stayed within the Italian communities. Poor Italian immigrants who didn't trust or understand the American authorities could go to the Black Hand with their problems and grievances. But the Black Hand also extorted protection money from these people, as well as running burglary, gambling, and extortion rings.
I was born on 15th Street and Avenue A, which is in the heart of Mulberry Street section. The original landing place for the Mustache Pete's from Sicily, way back in the late 1890s. The biggest complaint I had against them was that they were parasites on their own people, because their first source of income, large source of income, was extortion. They would extort money from the laborer, the office worker, the factory worker, the professional man. There was no limit to the area of extortion.
This small organization might very well have remained within the confines of the ethnic Italian neighborhoods had it not been for the United States government. It was the Congress of the United States that gave the Mafia its opportunity to grow and prosper, when in 1919 they made prohibition the law of the land, making alcohol illegal in America.
Prohibition was the thing that made the mob. Before that, it was just a bunch of small-time gangsters, didn't know what the they were doing. But Prohibition, when the government took the liquor away, they came in, they made millions of dollars.
It's a bunch of backstabbing cowards. That's what I found out. Just a bunch of low-life cowards.
All I ever wanted to do was be a made man in the mob. That's all I cared about. I studied it my whole life, the way other kids study history or math. I studied the history of the mob. I knew everything from Maranzano to Mazzaria to Gotti to everything. I thought it was going to be a thing of honor. In the end, I ended up being a rat to save my own ass.
Americans wanted alcohol. The government denied them. So organized crime stepped in to provide the nation with the alcohol it craved. In the New York underworld, gambler Arnold Rothstein was the biggest bootlegger. His main competition was a Sicilian gangster named Joseph the Boss Mazzaria. Mazzaria was an ignorant, violent man, but he saw the opportunity for untold riches in the bootlegging business. In the late 1920s, another Sicilian immigrant, Salvatore Maranzano, was sent to America by Sicilian mob boss Vito Ferro to get in on the bootlegging profits in the large and very thirsty New York market. War between Mazzaria and Maranzano was inevitable. They hated each other beyond all possible accommodations, and no two men could have been more opposite in style and background than Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano. Mazzaria was a sloppy, hard-drinking, almost illiterate man, while Maranzano was a cultured and educated man who had even studied for the priesthood. Both, however, were cold-blooded killers, and what was at stake was millions of dollars in cash profits from the bootlegging business.
Maranzano was a class act. He wore nice suits and was educated. Totally the opposite of that slob, Mazzaria.
Joe the Boss was a total slob. Dressed like shit, drank all the time. There's no way he was going to beat Maranzano in that war.
When Arnold Rothstein was murdered in 1928, an open war broke out between the Mazzaria and Maranzano families for control of the New York bootlegging rackets. Within a year, over 60 soldiers from both families had been killed. Gangsters throughout the city took sides in the conflict. One of Mazzaria's top aides was a young hoodlum named Charles Lucky Luciano, and one of Maranzano's top soldiers was a young man named Joseph Bonanno. Both Luciano and Bonanno were Sicilian immigrants, and both knew that the open warfare and the bodies piling up in the street were bad for business. They secretly banded together and came up with a plan to eliminate both Mazzaria and Maranzano. On April 15, 1931, Luciano met his boss, Joe Mazzaria, for lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. As soon as Mazzaria sat down, he was assassinated by Luciano cohorts Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel. Luciano then made the peace with Salvatore Maranzano, who was declared boss of bosses. His reign, however, was short-lived. Luciano knew that Maranzano, an egotistical and vain man, would stand in the way of Lucky's dream of a powerful national crime syndicate. In April of 1931, 4 men, posing as IRS agents, entered Maranzano's Park Avenue office. As soon as they entered Maranzano's inner office, they pulled guns from their coats and shot the boss of bosses dead. With Maranzano dead, Luciano and associate Meyer Lansky moved forward with Lucky's plan for a national organized crime syndicate. The plan was, in a backhanded way, absolutely brilliant. Each major city in the United States would be run by a mafia family headed by a don or godfather. Under the godfather would be 1 or 2 underbosses. The underbosses oversaw the captains, who were then in charge of crews of men known as soldiers. Luciano based this structure on the Roman legions. New York, however, because it was so large and so profitable and was the center of the Mafia's national power, would be shared by 5 families. The original 5 Mafia families established in New York were the Profaci, Bonanno, Luciano, Mangano, and Gagliano families. There would be a national commission comprised of 5 godfathers from various mafia families around the nation to settle disputes. This new organization was called La Cosa Nostra, a phrase meaning this thing of ours, in the Italian dialect of Sicilian.
Charlie Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky were f***ing geniuses. These 2 guys could have been the CEOs of any major corporation in America. The way they set the whole thing up and the organization was incredible.
In order to become a made man in a mafia family, a man had to be of 100% Italian heritage, preferably Sicilian. Men of other ethnic groups such as Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Joey Adonis could be associates of La Cosa Nostra, but none could become a made man within its ranks. In becoming a member of a mafia family, each man went through an initiation ceremony in which he took the oath of omerta, a pledge never to reveal the existence of La Cosa Nostra to anyone under penalty of death.
When I got made, I came into this room and there were 3 guys there. The captain and 2 underbosses from the family I was being made in. And they told me about this thing of ours, and I was going to become a made man, and that if they asked me if I would kill my brother, I said I would. And they asked me if I would leave my mother's deathbed if they called, and I said I would. And they told me that I was being baptized again into a new family, and that if I ever ratted out the family, it was under the pain of death.
Then they asked me what thing I shot with. And they pricked my finger with a needle so the blood dripped. Then they took a picture of the Virgin Mary, lit it on fire, and put it in my hands. And I had to hold it until it burnt up. They told me if I ever ratted them out, I would burn like that picture. I ended up being a f***ing rat anyway.
Who gambles? The average citizen. Who pays for prostitution? The average citizen. All they are is the pleasure machine, and you pay them. They're giving you all the vices in this world. If you got a vice, they'll provide you with it.
In the early 1930s, the nation was in the throes of the Great Depression. But this didn't affect the New York Mafia. It was during this decade that the New York mob built its business into a multi-billion-dollar crime empire. Although Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the mob had already made millions of dollars in cash. The speakeasies that they had run during Prohibition now became the most fashionable nightclubs in New York. During the 1930s, the New York mob had cash and lots of it. This enabled them to pay off politicians, judges, and police. They literally ruled New York City.
The Mafia could not exist unless certain people in the criminal justice system weren't doing their job. Either weren't doing the job because they were lazy or corrupt.
The mob ran protection rackets throughout the city, preying on small businesses. If a small store or business did not pay its monthly protection fee, the owner would be beaten or his establishment destroyed. The mob also controlled the New York racetracks, with Luciano underboss Frank Costello fixing races at Aqueduct. The newspapers portrayed the gangsters as entertaining and charming rogues. Columnists such as the powerful and influential Walter Winchell did nothing to expose the mob's criminal empire. Instead, Winchell made them into celebrities. The mob faced virtually no threat at all from law enforcement authorities. In New York, they had literally paid off law enforcement and the courts to leave them alone.
That was the time to be a gangster in the 1930s. That was really the golden era. The FBI left you alone. The law enforcement was all paid off. Nobody cared. Gangsters were celebrities. The only people who had cash were the gangsters. So they paid everybody off, and everybody just left them alone. I was born in the wrong time. I should have been back there in the 30s. That was really the best era to be a made guy.
On a national scale, the nation's most powerful crime fighter, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, denied the very existence of a mafia. It was obvious to everyone the mafia existed, but Hoover refused to acknowledge La Cosa Nostra. Instead, Hoover went after small-time bank robbers in the Midwest, such as Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger. These outlaws stole hundreds or maybe thousands of dollars from small banks, and their capture or killing got Hoover national headlines. But all the while, the mafia in America and in New York made billions in cash without Hoover lifting a finger to stop them. The rumor that circulated for many years was that Hoover was a homosexual who liked to cross-dress, and that the mob had pictures of the FBI director in a dress and in compromising positions, so Hoover left them alone. Whether this is true or not is pure conjecture, but the fact is, Hoover let the mob flourish for over 30 years while ignoring their activities. In New York, the mob had its hand in a large variety of businesses, both legitimate and criminal. They controlled nightclubs and restaurants. They ran gambling rackets and prostitution rings. They controlled all the major unions, including the Teamsters and Longshoremen's Union. They controlled the trucking and the garment district. They controlled the construction industry. And most importantly, they controlled the New York docks. The vast New York waterfront was the lifeline of the city. Goods were shipped in from around the world, and through the Longshoremen's Union, the mob held absolute control over the unloading of these ships. And with the Teamsters Union under its thumb, the mob controlled how these goods were trucked to the rest of the nation. They skimmed millions of dollars from the unions, hijacked or stole millions of dollars in goods from the ships, and set their own prices for the transport of goods throughout the nation. During this entire time, the mayor of New York was Jimmy Walker, who turned a blind eye to crime and ran one of the most corrupt administrations in the city's history. Finally, in 1932, the public, tired of the crime wave, elected Fiorello LaGuardia mayor of the city. LaGuardia promised to rid the city of its mobsters.
We intend to have a general house cleaning. Yes, we'll not only clean the streets of this city, but I'm going to clean every department of every grafting tammany politician and appoint honest men and women in their places.
LaGuardia appointed attorney Thomas E. Dewey as special prosecutor to go after the gangsters.
For 20 years, the machine-controlled district attorneys of New York County have prosecuted nothing but the small fry and the victims of organized crime. During those years, the underworld has preyed on our people and robbed them and then frightened them into silence.
Dewey's first target was mobster Dutch Schultz of the Bronx. Schultz, whose real name was Arthur Flegelmeyer, was Jewish and not a made member of any mafia family. Still, he was a powerful and violent gangster. The New York Cosa Nostra followed Dewey's pursuit of Schultz closely. At one point, Dutch decided that the only way to avoid prison was to kill Dewey. He tried to hire hitman Albert Anastasia to eliminate Dewey. Anastasia told Lucky Luciano of the Schultz plan. Luciano knew Dutch Schultz had to die. Luciano knew that the murder of Dewey would bring much unwanted publicity to the mob's vast criminal empire. In 1935, at the Palace Chop House in the Bronx, Schultz was hit by over 20 rounds from Luciano's gunmen. Schultz did not die immediately, but lingered for days as he slowly died. Unfortunately for Luciano, with the death of Dutch Schultz, Thomas Dewey turned his attention to Lucky Luciano himself. In 1937, Dewey was able to convict Lucky on trumped-up charges of running a prostitution ring. Luciano was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison.
Charlie Lucky Luciano, shackled to his henchman, the overlord of a $12 million a year vice ring, goes to prison for from 30 to 50 years. At Sing Sing, the droopy-eyed gang leader gets his last glimpse of the outside world for many years. When he comes out, he'll be an old man. New York's big shot is now just prisoner number 92168. The lowest form of racketeering has been given a death blow, and Lucky is lucky no more.
The members of the jury are entitled to the thanks of the whole community. By their verdict, they have reasserted the ability of democracy to clean its own house and cast out those who betray it.
Luciano's arrest, however, did nothing to slow down the growth and profits of the New York mob. In the early 1940s, the mob moved into the boxing racket. The man who ran this racket for the New York mob was Frankie Carbo. Carbo controlled the Managers Guild, the promoters and the matchmakers. The Friday night fights at the old Madison Square Garden became a lucrative business for the mob.
Frankie Carbo totally controlled everything when it came to boxing. I mean, everything. If you was a fighter, you didn't go to the bathroom without Frankie Carbo's permission.
Carbo fixed fights, and a fighter who didn't play ball with Carbo didn't get a title shot. The most glaring example of this was middleweight Jake LaMotta. For years, LaMotta refused to deal with Frankie Carbo. Despite winning over 40 fights against top competition, LaMotta could not get a shot at the middleweight title. Finally, with no other recourse, Jake met with Carbo. In November of 1947, LaMotta was matched against a far inferior fighter named Billy Fox. The fight was fixed, and LaMotta basically stood around in the ring and took punches from Fox. It was obvious to everyone that Jake had thrown the fight. The mob made a fortune on the bout. 2 years later, in October of 1949, Jake LaMotta got his title shot, won the middleweight crown, and held it for 2 years until he was beaten by Sugar Ray Robinson.
Jake was a bull. Jake LaMotta, I had the pleasure to work after when he came down. He retired for a while. He came to the allure of Florida like we all do, and I got to know him real well. And I worked with him a couple of fights. I mean, Jake LaMotta was a great fighter. Jake LaMotta fought Ray Robinson maybe 5-6 times. One fight greater than the other. You know, they were meant for each other. It was a blend. And Jake was a great fighter.
There were, on occasion, investigations into the corrupt fight game. But these were just window dressing. And the mob controlled the sport of boxing well into the 1960s.
Charlie Lucky Luciano got screwed. He helped the government. He cleaned up the waterfront. They promised him he would get amnesty after the war. Yeah, they gave him amnesty, but they sent him back to Sicily.
December 7th, 1941. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and America goes to war. To the New York Mafia, World War II was just another opportunity for profit. Because of war rationing, items such as tires, gas, meat, fresh fruit, stockings, and much more were in short supply. The mob, however, which controlled trucking and the city's waterfront, had endless supplies of these desired items and did a lucrative business on the black market. At one point during the war, sabotage by foreign agents on the New York waterfront became a real problem. The authorities could do nothing to stop it. As such, knowing that the mob controlled the docks, they turned to the imprisoned Lucky Luciano for help. The government turned a blind eye to the waterfront and let Luciano contact the people he needed to contact. Suddenly and dramatically, the sabotage stopped. For this, Luciano was promised amnesty after the war. With the war's end, he was released from prison, but deported to his native Sicily.
The first time I really ran into problems was, as an Italian American, was when I ran for Congress. And I think it becomes very easy to stereotype us by our ethnicity. And when I ran for vice president, I was stunned by how people came out and try to associate me with Mafia and things like that.
There's no question that it was Italians who were primarily responsible for turning crime into a multi-million-dollar business, and that most of the nation's infamous gangsters were of Italian descent. Nonetheless, these people have always represented a very minuscule segment of the entire Italian-American population in this nation. Even today, the FBI has identified approximately 3,000 members of organized crime out of a population of over 25 million Italian Americans in this country. Still, due to films like The Godfather and Goodfellas and TV shows such as The Sopranos, there is a constant and undeniable stereotype that most successful Italian Americans in this nation must somehow be connected to the mob. It's a stereotype that is constantly perpetuated in the media and a stigma that Italian Americans have had to live with since the 1930s.
I don't want to sound harsh, but there was a good deal of prejudice. A stereotypical, no one likes to be stereotyped. And as I said, during the Depression, those Capone years, those Lucky Luciano years, the Mafia, and especially if you were Sicilian, you were automatically a member of the Mafia, jokes about you. The ethnic slur words were very painful to me.
I think that's terrible. We should not stand for it. We cannot allow that to be said about us, because there are so many American Italians who did so much for this great nation of ours.
I think where we have made a mistake is that we've let people intimidate us with the Mafia and the gangster, and those are the kind. It isn't a question of the people that have gained the respect, the people who started the Bank of America, the Gallo Wine people, all of the great people that have done so much for this country, and every level, as you mentioned. But the thing that always bothers me is when somebody really does a good job and keeps his mouth shut, somebody's always saying, "Oh, the Mafia, the Mafia helped him. That happened." I mean, that's the one thing that we've had to live with, that we have not been able to put aside.
I think that one of the reasons it takes Italians longer than other people is they're not in the media. We do not have people in important places in the media, in newspapers, in magazines like Time and Newsweek, a U.S. World News Report, on NBC, CBS, or the channels that I haven't mentioned. We don't have people with the sensitivity to slurring Italians with the besmirching idea of organized crime affiliation. The Italian people, or Italian American people, do not have placed in positions of importance in the media anyone to look out for what makes us feel inferior. We've never had that. Now, if you're an internationally known or nationally known person like a Frank Sinatra, or a nationally known person like Mario Cuomo was when he was governor particularly, you have investigations, political adversaries going back, and they'll find perhaps, just for example, Mario Cuomo may have had gone to the theater and met somebody and had his picture taken with some guy who was a link to organized crime. That photograph would wipe out the career of Cuomo should he aspire to something like the White House. In the case of Sinatra, we know what it's done. I mean, poor Sinatra, and after he was only a saloon singer. I mean, Sinatra wasn't running to be president of the United States. But even if you're an entertainer, if you have an Italian name, you can be very embarrassed if people want to make your life miserable. They can do it.
The wise guys would have killed me if I'd went back in the street, or they would have killed me in a can. I was marked for death, so it didn't really matter.
I was forced into this program to save my life. They were going to kill me.
A major rule in La Cosa Nostra was that no made man could be murdered unless the hit was sanctioned by the National Commission. Once a hit was approved, the task of eliminating the victim became the responsibility of Albert Anastasia, known as Lord High Executioner and head of an organization dubbed Murder Incorporated by law enforcement authorities. Anastasia was an underboss of the Mangano family, and it was Don Vincent Mangano who put Anastasia in charge of contract hits.
He didn't want the job, understand? Because he knew somewhere down the road there's going to be problems. So he asked the boss to have a choice. Well, Vince spoke. He says, yeah, Albert, you got a choice. We either do the job, we know you could do it good, well, you know, or you go to the cemetery.
In the end, Albert Anastasia became quite good at his job, and authorities are certain he was responsible for over 500 killings during his reign. Anastasia was a volatile man with a violent temper who detested informers. Anastasia's brother, Tough Tony Anastasia, ran the New York waterfront, and together the brothers held much power in the New York mob. Anastasia, however, was viewed as a loose cannon by many other mob bosses and was nicknamed the Mad Hatter within the ranks of La Cosa Nostra. In October of 1957, Anastasia's own underboss, an up-and-coming gangster named Carlo Gambino, had Anastasia murdered while Anastasia sat in a barber's chair getting a shave.
Honor among thieves? I grew up believing that all my life. I found out that's a lie, too.
Those people have no consciences. They kill for pleasure, some of them. They're very vindictive. They're mean people.
When Lucky Luciano went to prison in 1937, he left Frank Costello in charge of his family. Another Luciano underboss named Vito Genovese was not happy about this decision. He had been with Lucky since the beginning and felt he should be the new godfather. Of all the powerful members of New York's underworld, Vito Genovese was perhaps the most ruthless and violent. Genovese's plan to overthrow Costello as boss of the Luciano family was short-circuited when he fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges. It seemed Vito had fallen in love with a married woman. In order to have this woman for his own, Vito had the husband thrown off a roof and then married the widow shortly thereafter. He faced murder charges for this crime and fled to Italy, where he stayed until 1944, when he was deported back to the United States to stand trial. Just before the trial, however, the 4 witnesses against Vito mysteriously disappeared, and the charges were dropped. By this time, his wife Anna had filed for divorce. She had already taken another lover while Vito was in exile in Italy. Shortly after Vito arrived back in America, his wife's lover was found dead in an alley, castrated, his private parts stuffed into his mouth. Vito's wife stopped the divorce proceedings.
Is it true that you're the head of the Mafia in this country?
It is not.
Well, sir, have you ever been connected with the Mafia at any time?
Never.
What about government charge? You're the right man. You're the number 1 man in this narcotics business.
The charges are fantastic.
Have you ever known anyone in the narcotics racket?
I never did.
Have you ever known anyone in the underworld?
In the end, however, Don Vito would play a pivotal role in the eventual downfall of the New York mob. The 1950s started out as a lucrative decade for the New York mob. But soon, events would take place that would see this empire of crime begin to crumble. In 1951, a senator from Tennessee named Estes Kefauver began an investigation into mob activities. The star of these televised hearings was crime boss Frank Costello. Costello was a man who yearned for respectability as a businessman. He insisted that only his hands be shown on television, although the newsreel cameras filmed all the proceedings. America was fascinated and enthralled by the hearings, which got higher ratings than the World Series that year. And although the hearings convicted nobody, it exposed the harsh reality of the Mafia to the American public.
I'm not going to answer another question. You just says I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
J. Edgar Hoover could no longer deny the existence of the mob, and the FBI took an active role in trying to bring down the Mafia. By 1957, things began to fall apart rapidly. In May of that year, an attempt was made on Frank Costello's life as he entered the lobby of his Park Avenue apartment building. The gunman, a man named Vincent Giganti, missed Costello's head and only nicked the gangster's ear. The hit was planned by Vito Genovese, who wanted Costello out of the way so he could take over the Luciano family. After the attempt on his life, Costello agreed to step aside as Don and retired to a life of leisure in Florida. However, the attempt on Costello's life brought about much unwanted publicity for the New York mob. Later that year, in October, Carlo Gambino had Albert Anastasia murdered, and this too caused headlines and news flashes across the nation.
You know, you see pictures of this guy, Carlo Gambino. He looks like a really gentle, grandfatherly type of guy. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He was a killer.
The murder of one boss, Anastasia, and the attempted murder of another, Costello, was unprecedented. The mob was in complete disarray.
Man, that meeting was a bad idea. What the hell were they thinking? A meeting of all the bosses? What a stupid f***ing idea.
Because of the turmoil in the underworld, the mob's National Commission decided that a meeting should be held, to be attended by all the bosses from all the crime families across the nation. The intention of this meeting was to put things back in order and settle all disputes. The meeting was scheduled for October of 1957 at the country home of a New York mobster named Joseph Barbera in the small upstate New York town of Appalachian. Over 80 leading gangsters from across the nation gathered in Appalachian. Unfortunately for them, 2 local police officers noticed dozens of big cars streaming to the Barbera home and decided to investigate. When the cops arrived, the gangsters took off, running into the woods and the surrounding farm fields. The police called in backup and over 60 gangsters were taken into custody. Although the arrests resulted in no convictions, the mob was once again exposed to public scrutiny. It was a public relations nightmare for the Mafia. Shortly after the Appalachian disaster, Vito Genovese was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. While in prison, Genovese heard that a soldier in his family named Joseph Valachi, also in prison, was talking to the authorities. Although this was not true, Genovese called for a hit on Valachi. Valachi found out he was a Genovese target and only then decided to talk to the authorities to save his own life. In hearings held in 1963, Valachi, who had participated in more than 50 hits for the New York mob, gave the government more information about the Mafia than they had ever had before.
When did you become a member of this organization? 1930. 1930.
About how many soldiers would usually be under a boss?
Well, certain families have about, say, Vito Genovese has about 450.
450?
In and around that.
450?
It was the beginning of the end for the New York mob, as well as for Mafia families around the nation.
When Valachi ratted us out, that was really the beginning of the end. Everything went down after that. He told the government things they never knew before about how the families were organized and how you got made. And the government never knew that kind of stuff. And it was kind of like a textbook on how to bust the mob.
It's going to take a lot of the public and a lot of law enforcement to stop it, and it should be stopped. And I'm doing everything I can, and hopefully one or two kids that see me on TV won't go that route, because it doesn't pay. It doesn't pay.
They're men of dishonor, and the men who are not worthy of any respect at all. It's as simple as that. I take the opposite view. I don't need to elaborate on that. They're criminal misfits. That's all they are. They're parasites.
The testimony of Joseph Valachi started a slow but steady collapse of the Mafia in America, and most certainly the disintegration of the most powerful part of the national crime syndicate, the Cosa Nostra in New York. Over the following 3 decades, local authorities and the FBI began chipping away at the New York mob, putting gangsters away on any charge they could make stick. In the early 1970s, a mob boss named Joe Colombo, who had taken over the Profaci family, decided to fight back by forming the Italian-American Civil Rights League. The irony of a New York mob boss heading up an Italian rights organization was lost on no one. Unfortunately for Colombo, this movement drew far too much media attention, and the National Commission decided to have Colombo murdered. Joey Gallo, a member of the Gambino family, hired a Harlem hitman named Jerome Johnson to take out Colombo. On June 28, 1971, in front of thousands of people at an Italian-American unity rally, Joe Colombo was shot in the head twice. Jerome Johnson was immediately killed by Colombo's bodyguards. Colombo himself lingered in a coma for 7 years before finally dying. The New York Mafia was falling apart. Then, in 1983, Godfather Joe Bonanno published his memoirs. In it, he revealed an enormous amount of information about the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra. Bonanno's revelations actually helped law enforcement in their fight against the mob. Bonanno himself was the only one of the original 5 godfathers of New York to actually make a clean getaway. After a long and lucrative criminal career, Joe Bananas, as he was known in the press, retired to a life of leisure in Arizona.
Joe Bonanno had a sense of almost imperial style about him. He was a princely man. I went to see Joe Bonanno on his 90th birthday, and he lives in Arizona, and I went to this country club, this wonderful, wonderful country club, and there was 350 people, black tie, and having a wonderful dinner in honor of Joe Bonanno, who, you know, is according to the Justice Department, is one of the devils on earth, but not that night. And that night in Arizona, it was like he was, like he was out of a wonderful film by Visconti or some other distinguished director of Italian filmmaking. He was a very cinematic character, to put it that way.
Another element that contributed greatly to the downfall of the New York mob was the passing into law of the RICO Act by the U.S. government in the early 1980s. Prior to this, law enforcement had to convict gangsters of a specific crime to put them away. With the RICO Act, all authorities had to do was prove that a man was a member of a crime organization. A young New York prosecutor named Rudolph Giuliani used the RICO Act to put away hundreds of New York mafioso. Another cause of the New York Mafia's downfall was drugs. Although there was always a rule in the Cosa Nostra that members couldn't deal in drugs under penalty of death, the profits were just too big to ignore. However, when mob members were caught dealing drugs and faced long jail sentences for drug trafficking, many turned state's evidence and went into the witness protection program. In the end, the man truly responsible for the ultimate downfall of the New York mob was one of its own, John Gotti. When Carlo Gambino went to prison, he made Big Paul Castellano the head of the Gambino family. Castellano was an old-fashioned gangster figure who truly believed in the old rules and codes of La Cosa Nostra and posed as a legitimate businessman. John Gotti was a young captain in the Gambino family who wanted power and was impatient with Castellano's way of doing things. Castellano knew Gotti was a threat and planned to have him murdered, but Gotti struck first. In December of 1985, Gotti, along with top associate Sammy the Bull Gravano, had Castellano gunned down in front of Sparks Steakhouse in New York City. Gotti then took over the Gambino family. Gotti was a flamboyant figure who, unlike old godfathers, loved publicity and enjoyed his celebrity status. He flaunted his position as a Mafia don. Law enforcement authorities tried unsuccessfully for years to put Gotti away. His ability to avoid conviction earned him the nickname the Teflon Don. Gotti knew, however, that the only man who could have him convicted of anything was his top associate, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gravano knew everything about the inner workings of the Gotti family, and Gotti decided to have Gravano murdered. Gravano found out about Gotti's plan, and to avoid his own prosecution on murder charges, decided to cooperate with the government to get Gotti. Sammy the Bull's testimony put John Gotti away for life in a federal prison where he died of cancer. The final blow to the New York mob came in 1996, when Godfather Vincent the Chin Gigante was arrested and jailed on RICO charges. Gigante, the man who shot and missed Frank Costello in 1957, had become Don of the Genovese family. He walked around Little Italy, New York in a bathrobe and slippers and feigned insanity to avoid prosecution. His ploy worked for many years, until the feds finally nailed him and proved him competent to stand trial. The 5 families of the New York Cosa Nostra still exist today, but they are far less powerful than the new Russian, South American, and Chinese crime syndicates who have made millions in the drug trade. Yet there are those in the law enforcement community who keep a watchful eye on what remains of the New York Mafia, always fearful that this once large, powerful, and evil crime empire will rise once again.
They're not gone. They might be on the run. They're going to change their tactics. They're going to give you a new look and a new face and a different person. But it's there. It will always be there.